When a police officer beats up a decorated black soldier during the day, the officer thinks it's his fault. He will continue to ignore racial injustice, but he's gravely mistaken. What he doesn't know is that the man he put in a coma has a son who can bring down the whole system. This is a civil rights story. A fierce fight for justice, reform, and corruption will deeply shake the community before we even begin. Tell us where you're watching from and if you care about justice. If you want to read more stories like this, please like and follow. As John Jack Carter walked down the narrow southern town in the late afternoon sun, long golden shadows fell across it. At the age of 68, Jack's step had slowed down on the streets he knew well, yet his back remained straight. He stood tall and straight. People in town still respected him because he was a man who had served his country. He spent most of his life quietly helping his community in Vietnam. Today I spent a few hours at the local soldiers' hall, having coffee with old friends and telling them about my day. A long time ago, Jack enjoyed a calm and normal afternoon. Something strange caught his eye as he walked through the town square. A small group of people began to gather across the park, near one of the seats. In the middle of it all, Officer Roy McDougal, who was big and stocky, squinted to see what was going on. Standing tall over a young man who looked trapped and uneasy, Jack knew right away that Roy was the cop. Roy had been a police officer for years and had a reputation for making things worse instead of better. However, rumors circulated about his harsh behavior toward younger individuals and those who didn't share his aesthetic. For the same amount of time, the young man, who looked like he was just out of his teens, stood stiffly as Roy's words cut through. Jack couldn't understand what the boy was saying, but he saw that his hands were shaking as he tried to get something out of his pocket. There were pockets of stress in the air, and Jack could see fear in the young man's eyes. He took a quick look around and saw the small group of people watching seemed frozen, unsure of whether to step in or leave. Jack sighed and continued on his way. He approached them, knowing things would get worse. As he got closer, Jack kept his voice steady and calm. "Is everything okay here?" asked Officer Roy. He snapped at Jack, narrowing his eyes at the older man who had just walked in. "This is none of your business," he said. Carter, Roy said in a sharp voice. "Keep walking." Jack ignored the harsh tone and continued walking. He glanced at the young man, who appeared more terrified than anything else. The boy had finally pulled out a tremble as he presented it for Roy's inspection. Roy grabbed it from him. He looked at it briefly before putting it in his pocket. "I'm just passing through," Jack answered. "It doesn't even look like the boy is making any trouble," Roy said. With his mouth muscles tensing up, Jack knew he was up against more than just an upset police officer. "I mentioned this because I was working with someone who was seeking an outlet for his anger. It doesn't matter to me," Roy growled as he approached Jack, as if his mere presence would suffice. Scare him, but Jack had faced far more challenging situations than an upset police officer, and he remained unflinching. "I've seen this happen many times." Jack said it in a soft but strong voice. "Like this." "I know when something's about to go bad," Roy said, his face red. He was accustomed to being in control during moments of rage, but now that others were watching, he felt that power slipping away. Roy couldn't stand it when people around him were quiet and calm. It was a challenge to his power. Tension pulsed through the air like a coiled spring ready to snap. Jack stood his ground and said, "No need for violence here." "Roy, let the boy go because he doesn't seem to have done anything wrong." Roy's face turned red with anger, and before Jack could respond, Roy shoved him. The force hit him hard, causing him to fall backward. The crowd gasped in shock at the sudden noise. As the situation worsened, Jack found himself slowly straightening up, feeling the familiar pain in his joints, but refusing to. Years of perseverance told him to back down and leave this alone, but his morals told him not to, would not let him. Jack knew this was a time to be strong. Jack spoke quietly, his voice low, but with the weight of someone who wasn't afraid to face reality. "Roy." His hands clenched, his body stiff with anger as he lost focus. Suddenly, he swung his fist at her. The blow struck Jack squarely in the face with such force that he fell backwards, his body crumpling up in the process. He struck the ground forcefully, and his head collided with the sidewalk with a disconcerting pop. The shocked crowd stood there and watched. The sight of blood pooling beneath Jack's head was frightening. Everything seemed to freeze in place for a moment, but then chaos broke out. People erupted, rushing to help Jack. Others took out their phones to record the shocking scene. As he stepped back, the quick violence made his face pale and left him short of breath. His mind raced as he tried to figure out how, seeing what was going on, he grabbed his radio and called for help, his voice shaking. He knew he had to act quickly, because this new twist in the story made it look like Jack was the one who had hurt him. His heart was racing as he ran. He altered the narrative in his mind and began crafting his case, but Roy was unaware of the impact of his actions. He had just set off something much bigger than he could have imagined. The situation swiftly deteriorated, leaving Jack motionless on the ground. From the back of the head gash, blood ran to the ground. The object had hit the ground, and his once strong body appeared incredibly weak and dead. Some people in the crowd rushed forward and kneeled next to him, while others stood still, shocked by what they had seen. "I just saw someone call an ambulance." A woman cried out, her voice trembling with terror. The young man who had been in the middle of the first fight, he stood still, his eyes wide with fear. He looked at Officer Roy. It was clear that McDougal was scared because Roy's chest rose and fell quickly. He still clenched his hands at his sides, seemingly prepared for another blow. The anger that had driven him moments before was still there. It had earlier turned warmer and more calculated, and Roy messed with his. He radioed for help immediately, but his shaky voice betrayed his fear. "We've got a suspect who was hurt and needed medical help at the park," he said, adding a lie to his words that would hopefully save him. He looked at the small group of people gathered around Jack and tried to stand up straight. They tried to regain control of the situation, but it was already too late. Individuals in the vicinity lifted their phones to capture images of the lifeless body of veteran Jack Carter. The cop in charge stood over him, looking pale and shaken. This scene was about to unfold. News spread far beyond this small park. The ambulance sounds were loud as paramedics rushed to Neil. Among them was a younger man with a sense of urgency who stood next to Jack and quickly checked his pulse. The paramedic swiftly checked his pulse, but he was in poor condition, muttering to his partner. He may have sustained a head injury or other damage. They carefully placed Jack on a bed. As they worked, Jack's body remained motionless. The crowd whispered in shock as they watched, urging Jack to remain steady. It was someone they all knew, liked, and even respected to see him laid out like this. Witnessing the brutality was nearly unbearable. As the rescuers wheeled Jack to the ambulance, he was breathing shallowly, and as they worked quickly to close the wound, a thin tube was now giving him oxygen. "Will he be okay?" someone asked at the ambulance doors. The rescuer's answer was grim eye. I don't know why the ambulance sped off, its sirens sounding far away. However, a sense of unease and tension persisted in the air. Officer Roy stood alone, and the crowd watched him in quiet. The original fear had gone away, and he could now feel a cold, firm determination. The weight of their footsteps and the unspoken judgment in their eyes caused his hand to twitch. He was on the verge of pulling out his gun when he realized he was losing control. Suddenly, a man from the crowd spoke up. He stood up and said in a cool but clear voice, "That wasn't self-defense, Roy." "We all saw what you did." Roy glanced at the man and then at the entire crowd. There were more quiet whispers. There were louder charges floating around, but no one was brave enough to say they were wrong yet. Roy barked. He got involved in the police business to keep his power, but his words didn't mean anything anymore. The crowd wasn't paying attention to him, and the phones were still recording. Whatever power he had was quickly fading. He turned his back on her as he felt his gut twist through his fingers. He was aware that this situation had the potential to escalate rapidly. He walked rapidly and agitatedly toward them, contemplating his next move. He needed to clarify his account before assistance arrived, and additional officers could understand the true situation. Soon after, the chief came on the scene. Roy was the first to speak. "It got out of hand, Chief," he said, keeping his cool. "The guy stepped in while I was questioning the kid, and he got angry. I had to protect myself." The police chief scrutinized Roy for an extended period. The chief was a rough man who had been a police officer longer than most. Flashed toward the bloodstain on the sidewalk where Jack had fallen, and then toward the people, feeling that it was already getting out of hand. "And I don't care what your story is, McDougal," the chief said. His voice was so low that only Roy could hear it. "This situation could potentially lead to chaos, so it would be best to avoid including your story." Using sticks, the chief turned and communicated with one of the other officers who had arrived to clear the area. Roy had to keep his tone strong, and he swallowed hard. His adrenaline was still pumping. Constriction had previously constricted his veins, but this situation was unique. This wasn't just a small arrest gone wrong. It was something much bigger and longer. The longer he stood there, the more he realized how badly he had messed up. Later that night, word of the story went viral so quickly that by the time the local news picked it up, there were already clips of the fights. In the authentic videos, people on social media could see Jack intervening and attempting to calm things down. Roy's violent attack on the situation quickly sparked public outrage. People from all over town met in the town square to demand answers. "Justice for Jack" signs protesters immediately scribbled their demands for Roy's suspension on cardboard. The idea of a veteran facing an attack in broad daylight was unpopular. There were rumors of police brutality, which many people knew about. Fears of injustice, previously suppressed, now erupted in full force at Jack's hospital. As his condition got worse, doctors tried to reduce the swelling in his brain, but they couldn't promise he had. He fell into a coma, and his body stopped responding. The prognosis was unclear. A hospital room that used to be a place for recovery was now a place to wait for life-changing news from outside the hospital. A small group of Jack's family and friends stood in vigil and prayed for his recovery. This group included a fellow man who had served with Jack or knew him from the neighborhood hall and had visible scars on their faces. As night fell and tension hung thick in the air, there was quiet anger, sadness, and shock. The people in the air started to sense something bad. This wouldn't be easy to fix. They had forgotten about Jack Carter, the man they all looked up to, who stood between life and death. The town was tense at that moment. It was early evening when Michael Carter's phone rang, diverting his focus. The papers were all over his desk. He was in his office. Awards and diplomas adorned the walls. Michael was used to thinking back on the path that led him to his job as State Attorney General. "I receive calls outside of business hours regarding cases, politics, or while there were civil rights violations that required his attention. This particular call was unique." He picked up the phone without knowing who it was. He said Carter's number in a quick, business-like voice. "Carter, I'm struggling to find the right words, but it's all about you." Michael's heart rate increased, prompting my dad to question him. despite his calm appearance. Suddenly the woman started to crack as she talked about what had happened. She spoke quickly, and her words ran into each other. He suffered severe injuries in an accident and is currently in a coma at the hospital. As a police officer, I witnessed a fight in the park. You should come here. The words hit Michael with the force of a powerful train. They came from his father, Jack Carter, who had always been a staunch Catholic. The hospital found strength after a long time of hard work and war. Michael didn't move while he was in bed, barely alive and asleep. His mind struggled to comprehend the devastating news that a police officer had injured his father, leaving him in a coma. "Are you there, Mr. Carter?" the man on the other end of the line asked hesitantly. "I'm here," Michael replied. "Now my voice is low and calm. I'm coming," he said as he stopped the call, his hand shaking a little. He put the phone back on his desk. Michael sat there for a long time, his mind filled with what this meant. The people who were supposed to protect him hurt his father. He was in a hospital bed and might never wake up. It hadn't hit him yet how awful things really were. The police officer was unaware of Jack's son's identity. It turned out that the man he put in the hospital was the father of the state's top police officer. He fought for justice and responsibility all his life. Michael stood up quickly and pulled on his jacket. He was already preparing to take action, having witnessed instances of police misconduct and cover-ups in the past. He tried to hide the truth, but this was different from other times. For a moment it was personal. His office, which was clean and efficient, seemed too quiet now. The calm before the storm. This cop had no idea what he was starting. Michael. He wasn't just another anxious family member. He was the Attorney General. A man with immense power who could tear apart a corrupt system and expose every lie and wrongdoing he uncovers. He walked out the door with his briefcase in hand. He planned to see his father at the hospital first, but after that he would make sure that every police officer and anyone else who had done nothing paid. When Michael got to the hospital, it was almost night time. His mind was racing, but his face was a mask of confusion. Years of fighting in court and working for the government had taught him to keep his cool, putting feelings aside until it was time to act. But seeing his father, Jack Carter, the man who I grew up with him and taught him to stand up for what's right. He was asleep in a hospital bed with tubes coming out of his arms. Michael stood at the edge of the room with his hands squeezed into fists at his sides. There was a lot of quiet because the machines were making noise. The monitor's beeps were like a running clock, telling him how much time he had left to fix things. A nurse walked into the room. The room was quiet, and her face was filled with sadness. "He's stable for the time being, but she still has a head injury. We're really looking for the right words and are doing everything we can." Michael nodded, and his eyes never left his dad's face. "Thank you," he said in a rough but steady voice. She left the room with a sad smile, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts for a moment. The machines were steadily buzzing, and his mind was replaying the words he had heard on the phone. A police officer did this, and now that officer would have to deal with the full force of justice. Michael let out a sharp breath, his rage growing even stronger. His father was a man who had served his country. Because of someone who swore to protect people, not hurt them, his country was lying in a hospital bed. There was a lot of deception, but Michael wouldn't let his feelings get in the way of his work. When Michael left the hospital, it was bustling with people. News of what had happened had spread quickly. There were already protests going on. A big group of people with signs had gathered outside the police station, demanding answers, with Jack's name written on them. Michael knew this was going to happen because videos of the attack went viral on the internet. The whole state was watching Michael. Many of them knew his face. He wasn't an unknown to anyone. However, his appearance took on a new significance now that the reporters waiting outside the hospital were aware of his identity. Right away, a few reporters spoke up, their voices filled with more questions. Their cameras caught every move, Mr. Carter. Could you say something about how is your dad's health? Do you have anything to say about what the police officer did? Michael raised his voice and cut the line. Through the chaos, he spoke with cool authority. My father is in critical condition. His tone was calm, even though he was angry. It was clear below that there would be a full investigation, and I wouldn't stop until the truth came out and justice was done. Once the food arrived, the throng subsided and journalists started taking notes. Cameras continued to roll, catching the moment Michael turned and walked toward his car without saying a word. His lawyers were waiting for him. He had already been warned, and they were gathering proof while he got ready to go after the system that had let it happen. The police officer who put his father in the hospital bed that night had no idea what was going to happen the next morning. The town seemed to carry more weight. Jack's countenance reflected the recognition and admiration of a man. News outlets extensively covered the service, and the picture of him unconscious in the park became a symbol. More than signs or news, Michael Carter cared about his dad. He felt that fact's weight on him as he sat in his office with his team around him, going over the fact that he had spent the entire night reviewing all of the witness statements and other evidence so far gathered. As police reports and video footage of the attack poured in, the picture became clear, and it wasn't a fair one. Officer Roy McDougal used too much force, and his father is now in a coma. Michael understood that the issue extended beyond just McDougal. Roy has been a problem for long time, Michael's lawyer, who stated that he was reviewing McDougal's personnel file, which had been forwarded to him by a whistleblower inside the department, and ignored multiple reports of excessive force, harassment, and racial bias. Michael's jaw tightened as the rug shielded him. How far back does the advisor state that the majority of reports dating back years were never even considered for inclusion on the review board? But now that there is video proof and a public protest, they won't be able to hide it this time, Michael nodded, taking it all in. This was no longer just about one cop. The way the department had let officers like McDougal work was part of their protectionism mindset. He re-watched the attack video and saw Roy striking him for an extended period without any consequences. The father watched the hit and fall unfold on the screen in slow motion. Jack would never forget seeing the blood pooling under his head. Don't forget that we'll be charging McDougal, Michael said in a steady voice. We're not done yet. If there's a full review of how the department handled his complaints, I want it. Corruption will show it, and everyone who helped him will be brought down with him. His team unanimously agreed that Michael would not hesitate to confront justice across town. Officer Roy McGough was tense as he sat in the police station. As we watched the effects of the event play out, the news stories never stopped. His name was all over the news, and every news outlet in the country was talking about what he did. Roy found himself in a state of chaos, with people gathering outside the station, calling for his arrest. Roy, you need to stay out of problems for a while. This was different. Things were getting out of hand. As the police chief paced back and forth in front of him, he said, "This is turning into a storm. The Attorney General is looking into this. Michael Carter is his son, for God's sake. I should have known," Roy snapped, his voice tense with fear. Without saying a word, he simply intervened. "Do you think that will matter?" The chief cut him off. "Do you think anyone will care what he said or didn't say? Roy, people saw videos of what you did." Roy leaned back in his chair and rubbed his head. He could feel the walls closing in around him, pressing the palm of his hand against his face. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him. He made a big mistake and could no longer hide, the boss said. He sighed and crossed his arms over his desk. "We'll do everything we can to protect you, but if Carter's involved," he said, "if Michael Carter was responsible for the rest of the line, then look into it. There's no safety. The chief and I knew." In the afternoon of that same day, Michael held his first press conference in front of the courts, where cameras could see him, flashed, and reporters yelled questions from the crowd. His face was calm and controlled, yet he was filled with fire. Everyone could see Michael's eyes. "I want to be clear," he said. "We will carefully and thoroughly investigate what happened in the park and what people did. Of Officer Roy McDougal, there will be no more lies and no more security for those." The reporters' crowd fell silent. True justice will prevail. Sharp pens screech across notepads. Michael's name was known for his zero-tolerance policy, stance on graft, and now that his father is in the hospital, no one. "We didn't think he would follow this case with unwavering force. We will be filing charges against the officer. McDougal for attacking my dad, Jack Carter." Michael kept going, but this, apart from the actions of a single officer, the investigation will scrutinize the methods by which the police force officer. McDougal has been reported before, and we will address department misconduct. Brought to light. Michael didn't raise his voice, but his words were so serious that they hung in the air like a storm cloud. There was no doubt in his mind that he was going to get McDougal and everyone else who had helped him. He was protected by everyone who had allowed him to commit violent crimes without being caught. A reporter stepped forward, his voice clear over the murmurs. "Mr. Carter, can you say anything about your father's condition? Is there any new information?" Michael's face briefly displayed emotion before returning to his usual self. "Keep calm. My father is still in critical condition," he said quietly. "We're hopeful. But we're ready for whatever comes next." There was a heavy pause, and the reporters looked at each other. It was clear that Michael was struggling, but his drive had made him successful. The press conference was over. Not long after, the message was clear. Michael Carter was coming for justice, not for corruption. On his way back to the police station, not a single department would stand in his way. The chief looked out of his window. From my office window, I could see protesters gathering outside. The crowd was getting bigger by the hour, and there was a chance that the streets rang with the sound of "Justice for J.A. back." He turned back to Roy, who was sitting in the corner with his head in his hands. "We can't protect you from this," the chief said in a stern voice. "You're on your own, Roy." He didn't answer because the sound of protesters shouting outside his house was too much for him to handle. Michael Carter was sitting at his desk and going over the files in front of him. The sound of the office filled his ears. Michael's team had made a lot of progress in their investigation into his father's cruel attack, but the weight of the case was making him tired, and he hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father lying in bed. He was stuck in a hospital bed with tubes and machines keeping him alive. It was already late afternoon when he looked at the clock, but the day hadn't slowed down at all. His team was in high gear. They were also putting together proof, filing motions, and preparing for what was likely to be a long and difficult fight. There were too many eyes on this case, and too much at stake for him to mess up. His phone rang, waking him up. "We've learned more about McDougal's past through one of his lead detectives. Said it's worse than we thought. Not only does he have a history of using too much force, but we also found internal notes from the department concerned about his behavior." The department head was aware of McDougal's problematic behavior. Michael's jaw clenched as he spoke, grabbed the phone. "It's one thing to believe that Roy was covered by the department. It's another to actually have proof that he knew there was a lot of corruption in some parts of the police force, but the fact that it had been ongoing for a long time, with Roy and other police officers receiving protection." I took notes on everything Michael said in a low but strong voice. The investigator answered, "A report on everything they tried to hide will bring it all to light. There's more. The boss is getting tense. He's supposedly feeling the stress. I believe we're almost at a break." Michael hung up the phone and watched activists gather outside the courthouse through the window. The town was becoming increasingly tense, and he was aware that things could worsen if justice wasn't served promptly. Even though Michael was getting ready to clean up the police department's crime, he felt like he couldn't do it. As he got older, he had always been methodical and careful in what he did. Feeling down. He couldn't be feeling down right now, but with each step forward and piece of proof, his team discovered that he was experiencing a surge of awe within him. This wasn't a story. This was real. He had deep affection for his father, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. Michael, who had been a constant source of strength and courage, was now in a coma because of a system that had failed him. His father had imparted numerous valuable lessons to him, and he reflected on them each time he thought of Jack. Michael learned justice, honesty, and doing the right thing, even when it was hard throughout his life. He had devoted his entire life to the pursuit of justice, and now he stood ready to reveal the corruption that had made it possible. He allowed the person who attacked his father to do what they wanted, feeling the usual pull of grief and anger that was about to overwhelm him. On the other side of town, Roy McDougal was sitting in the small flat he had been hiding in for a few days. There were walls around him as he watched the news tear him apart piece by piece. Every headline, every news story. Protesters outside the police station reportedly made him look like a monster with each angry tweet. He was fired. His career in the police force appeared to be over. The chief had effectively dismissed him from the police force and instructed him to avoid any trouble. Roy hoped for the best, but he knew he couldn't run away from this with Michael Carter in charge. Roy's phone. He thought for a moment before answering the phone. It was his lawyer calling to say, "They're coming after you, Roy the lawyer." Say in a cold, matter-of-fact voice that they have video proof and are checking your record to make sure there's nothing. "I can't do much unless you're ready to make a deal." Roy's blood ran cold. The lawyer went on, "I can't go to prison. I don't have many options here. If you don't help, Carter says they'll use all their resources against you." Roy didn't answer. He knew the lawyer was right, but the thought of what was going to happen scared him. He was no longer facing public backlash. He was facing jail time and real consequences, and there was no way out of it. Back at the hospital, Jack's situation didn't change. The doctors did everything they could, but Jack was in a deep coma, and the outlook was still unclear. His friends and fellow soldiers had taken turns keeping him under observation. They stayed awake at his bedside, their presence a quiet but steady sign of support. Michael went to the hospital. Every day, Jack spent what little time he could with his dad, but each visit made him feel worse. The main force in Michael's life had always been this man, who was tiny and so quiet. Michael now lay motionless, barely clinging to life. "Hey, Dad," Michael whispered. Evening, as he sat next to Jack's hospital bed with his hand on his, "I promised that I would do everything I could to get justice for you." The regular beat of Jack's heart was the only sound in the room as Michael leaned back in his chair. With tears in his eyes from being tired and sad, there were short times when he wasn't sure if he had. The drive to keep going with the case was too personal, and sometimes he initially thought it might crush him, but then he recalled his father's words and the lessons he had taught. "I told him, you don't quit a fight until it's over." That thought helped Michael calm down. He wiped his eyes and got up. He still had work to complete. Michael would continue to battle against the walls of the police chief's office as long as his father was struggling to survive. As Michael Carter stepped inside, it felt extremely tight. His face was locked, but Chief Leland Green sat behind his desk with his arms crossed. He seemed very powerful. They crossed their arms in an attempt to maintain control, but the tension in the room was evident. He was under attack, and he knew Michael Carter wasn't here to have a pleasant conversation. Michael took his time. Gazing around the office, he took in the framed awards adorning the wall and the pictures of smiling green people. Officers and the department's emblem that hung behind the chief's desk were all signs of an organization that had he and his father both failed the community by allowing wrongdoing to occur. Festa is within its lines. Chief Green cleared his throat and attempted to smile, but his eyes fell short. General Carter, thank you for joining us to discuss Save It, Michael said. He didn't bother to sit down. We're not here for small talk, Chief. Green tensed up, and the fake smile fell off his face. Now hold on, he said. McDougal did what he did on his own. The department wasn't involved in some kind of plot. The man has always been angry, but that hasn't changed. My dad died because of his anger. Michael cut him off cold, and it's not this concerns McDougal and the manner in which your organization handled his grievances, the deceit and the culture of silence. You allowed it to develop under your supervision. Green leaned back in his chair. He suddenly looked tired, like the stress of the situation was getting to him. Michael Carter, whom he had known for years, had seen him. He worked his way up in the law world and became the state attorney general. But this Michael was a Green who had never seen this side of him before. Michael wasn't giving up, and he didn't stop. Evidence, Chief's internal notes, which list complaints against McDougal that were dismissed without due process, investigation papers that you have signed. Green's face lit up as he opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. He could feel the walls closing in on him. Michael wasn't lying. He had if the proof surfaced, it would end Green's career and expose the true nature of the department. Was a real place where crime had grown, and we're going to charge Roy McDougal with attack and misconduct. Michael kept talking in a cold, steady voice. But we're not stopping there, we're launching. We ignored every report, investigated every complaint, and discovered everything. We made changes to ensure your police officers' safety. Everything will appear as expected. His hands were on his desk as he sat in his chair. Carter, you know how this goes. His voice was low as he spoke. Sometimes we have to deal with messy situations. Watch out for our own. Michael's eyes lit up with anger. It's not your job to... Unfortunately, you failed to keep this town safe, and now you must pay the price. For a long time, the room was quiet. Michael's words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and Green knew there was no escape. His mind was racing as he tried to figure out a way out, but couldn't. Green finally gave up and slouched back in his chair, failure written all over his face. What do you want from me, Michael? I didn't blink. I want to work with by the end of the investigation. I want all McDougal's files, memos, and emails on my desk. I want your department to publicly apologize for the mistakes that led to my dad's attack. Green took a deep breath and said, You'll get it. He knew he had no other choice. Michael abruptly left the office without waiting for anyone to respond. He quickly left the office. With careful, controlled steps, the police chief sat behind his desk and stared. At the door, Roy McDougal was. Roy McDougal's career was in jeopardy, and his department was on the verge of collapse across town. He sat in his room and stared at the wall every time he turned around. He was so scared. Officer Roy McDougal's name was all over the news every time he turned on the TV or checked his phone. Was the one who put a beloved warrior in a coma. His lawyer told him to stay out of trouble, but he knew that wasn't enough. He knew what was coming. Michael Carter had made a living by killing men who were similar to him, specifically police officers. They thought they could abuse their power without getting caught, and Michael had every reason to go after him. Roy's hands were shaking as he picked up his phone and started looking through it. They were delving into his past through a never-ending stream of news stories, each one more distressing than the last. Every complaint and instance where he had overreached was now surfaced, and he had no control over it. He told himself to stop as he thought about the punch and how Jack's head had cracked on the ground. He had not intended for things to escalate to that extent. He was angry, but he did not mean to put the old man in a coma. What the person meant didn't matter. The damage was already done, and Roy knew that time was running out in his office. Michael Carter stood in front of the big window that looked out over the courthouse square. There was an as the search progressed, the situation began to shift. Pieces were starting to fall into place, and very soon, there they were. No one, not even Roy McDougal or the corrupt police officers who had been defending him, could escape. His phone rang. It was his. "Lead investigator again. We have what we need," she said, her voice full of, "The boss is cooperating with us, and the files are being received. We've found more accusations against McDougal, refrains from using excessive force due to the concealment of race-related reports. His department as a whole is sick, not just him." Michael nodded, feeling a rush of grim pleasure. He finished the call with his eyes still on the protesters below. "We're going to tear this whole thing down," he said. Town was about to change forever, and Michael was ready to lead. Reporters and protesters packed the building, their voices blending into a loud roar. The entire town was on edge as people crowded around the steps, anticipating the arrest of Officer Roy McDougal inside. Michael Carter was sitting at a table with his lawyers. Their faces were calm and focused on what they were doing. Finally, the weeks-long planning for the building had come to fruition. Every lie, every report that was hidden, and every complaint about Roy McDougal that we were prepared to bring him to justice. Michael took a quick look at the large stack of papers in front of him. The charge was one of them. Days of careful consideration led to the filing of attack and misconduct charges. The police had ignored a past of racist behavior for years. The proof was huge, and there was no longer any question that Roy would have to deal with the full force of the law. The room's door closed. The door opened, and Michael's lead detective walked in. She looked tense. She expressed her certainty that it was time. Michael nodded and stood up. Roy did something bad to his father, and he had been waiting for this moment to hold him responsible. But as he walked toward the courtroom, he could still feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Roy. No longer was it about McDougal. It was about a broken system that had let down his father and many others like him. Two other officers led Officer Roy McDougal toward the building, drawing boos and yells from the crowd. When she saw him, he had lost his once cocky attitude and had the pale, haunted look of a man whose world was falling apart. Roy kept his head down and his shoulders hunched, which made the marchers even more angry. On the other hand, the public's anger weighed heavily on him. He could hear the opportunity and feel the stares. He was aware that this was not the intended outcome. He had thought he could lie his way out of this. The police would protect him like they always had, but as he got closer to the courts, he saw the truth. As they threw him to the wolves, the police officers who were with him didn't say a word. There was no sense of unity or solidarity. He was now alone, just as the chief had told him he would be. His hands were bound and his mind was racing as he tried to. Michael stood tall when the judge walked in, trying to figure out what went so badly in the courtroom. The room was packed. He wanted to speak with reporters, town leaders, and some friends of his father. Michael was determined to bring justice to these veterans who had always supported Jack. The judge, determined not to disappoint them, cleared her throat, and her voice echoed throughout the room. "We are here to Officer Roy McDougal was officially charged with felony assault. There was misconduct and violations of human rights. The court will now read the charges." The charges were read out loud. Michael looked closely at Roy's face. There was no fight. Roy sat still, his face pale and his eyes wide. He had no courage left in him. He was staring straight ahead as the weight of the charge pressed down on him. The video showed that the proof was overwhelming. There was videotape, witness statements, and internal reports that the department had buried. It was all out in the open. Now that the case was open, there was no escaping it. When the judge was done, Roy's lawyer rose looking, quit, and we waived the reading of he said in a quiet voice, "My client understands the charges." The courtroom became tense. Everyone stared at Roy as they led him out of the room, still wearing handcuffs. They laid the official charges and freed Roy. Now MacDougall would go to court. There was no joy or cheering in the courtroom, just the sad truth of what had been done. But when the news came out that Roy MacDougall had been arrested, the crowd outside the building cheered. It was the first time in weeks that there was hope. There was a sense of optimism that justice would prevail and the system would undergo repairs. The corruption, which had enabled police officers such as Roy to carry out their duties undetected, would ultimately face its downfall. Michael Carter went outside and stood on the steps of the building. As he spoke to the crowd, the cameras turned to him. The media leaned forward to record his speech. "Just the beginning," Michael said in a cool but determined voice. "We will put Officer Roy MacDougall on trial for his actions and ensure the administration of justice. But this isn't just about justice. This is not about a single police officer. It's about a system that allowed this to occur, a system that let my father down and failed him." The crowd in this town went silent as they listened carefully. There will be a thorough investigation into how the police department handled complaints, and anyone involved, the people responsible for the cover-up, will undergo reforms and changes. The people in this town deserve better, and we will give it to them. They wouldn't let up until those responsible for these failures faced justice. The crowd cheered again, and cheers filled the air. The fight continued, but this was a victory and a step toward justice. When they got back to the police station, Chief Green sat in his office and stared blankly at the wall where the files had been. Turned over the cover-up, which showed that he had helped protect Roy MacDougall. The department was in a state of chaos. It was a mess, and the protests outside were a daily reminder of how badly things had gone. He knew his days were numbered. They were aware that the department's investigation would only worsen over time. Michael Carter's office had been relentless in finding every mistake and failure, so he had to step down. It was clear that the department's image was in inadequate shape. Green leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of his career pressing down on him. Down on him because he had made his choices and was now having to pay for them as Michael left the building and his phone rang. It was the hospital. His heart sank as he heard the call. Mr. Carter replied, "It's about your dad." Michael Carter's hands shake. He gripped his phone a little tighter as the nurse on the other end of the line spoke again, her voice soft. "But your dad's health has changed, Mr. Carter. Please come as soon as possible." Michael stood there on the steps of the building for a moment, frozen. His mind was racing. Jack had been in a coma for weeks. Even though his health had improved, the doctors had told him that anything could happen at any time, so he was ready. He wasn't prepared for this moment at all. His car sped through town quickly. As the streets blurred by and the sounds of protesters shouting faded into the background, he could see the hospital ahead of him. Jack had visited the same spot every day since the attack. Each time, Jack had remained consistent, nearly unchanging. There was something off about him. The nurses guided him to his familiar room. As usual, he remained motionless while the machines hummed in sync with his shallow breathing. The doctor was standing waiting for him, his expression perfectly neutral. "He's stable for now," the doctor said, but he wasn't sure what to do. He sighed as his brain activity dropped significantly. If things don't get better soon, you may have Michael's breath caught in his throat as he thought about his choices. The wars, the accusations, and the changes all seemed small in comparison to the fact that, given the risky nature of life in this room, he advocated for justice and accountability. But what about the guy who is lying here? What about his father? He was taught right from wrong when he was a child and taught him to never give up. Michael sat next to his dad as the hum of the machines faded into the background, leaving him feeling overwhelmed for the first time since the event. It wasn't from the weight of rather than work or justice. He was sad about possibly losing his father. He said goodbye. He had spent a lot of time fighting the system and for change. He wasn't ready to accept the possibility that Jack might never wake up. He grabbed his dad by the hand and spoke in a stern voice. "I'm still fighting for you, Dad. We're getting justice, but I need you to come back." Outside of the hospital, none of the machines changed. Roy McDougal was still being charged. The protest had grown even bigger throughout the town, but people were now hopeful that Roy's hearing would go well. People in the town finally thought that change was possible after a long time. But Michael knew that because the charge wasn't enough, his team kept looking through the police department's records and found the pattern of systemic neglect dates back years to cops who repeatedly complained about racial bias. The department's leaders protected those who used force or were dishonest from consequences. Operating on a culture of quiet and cooperation, Michael's lawyers were already preparing to release a report. That would force the department to face its mistakes. It had been shown that the chief had helped hide them. People were increasingly demanding his resignation due to his poor behavior. The town was eager for change, and Michael was ready for it. A group of people met in front of the courthouse again a few days later, this time for an entirely different reason. The police chief finally quit after days of growing pressure. He was leaving. The community viewed it as a victory and an indication that things were beginning to improve. Michael Carter spoke to the crowd and said that he had kept his word so far. The department was still under investigation, the chief had resigned, and he was aware of the charges. Officer McDougal faced charges long ago, leading to Chief Green's resignation. These are steps toward justice for Michael. "We're not done yet. My office is committed," he said in a steady, firm voice. "We are managing the changes made to this police department to ensure that this kind of wrongdoing and corruption never happens again. Happen again." The crowd cheered, and there was a clear sense of victory. But Michael stayed. He remained focused because he understood that justice encompassed more than just sentencing criminals. Making a system that worked better, was more fair, and was more just. As the crowd spread out, a person Michael knew came up to him from the side of the stairs. Sarah Thompson, a local civil rights worker. She put out her hand. They had collaborated during the weeks following Jack's attack, and her guidance had proven invaluable. Michael Sarah stated that his assistance in organizing the protests and exerting pressure on the department has been invaluable. With a soft smile, "You brought justice." Michael shook his head. "We did it, but we still have a long way to go," she said with a nod. Despite the weight of what he said, the community had fought hard, and there was still time that night to heal. Michael went back to the hospital. The room was quiet. The machine was still quietly running, and there was a strong smell of disinfectant. He sat by Jack's side again, his heart heavy, but a little lighter. He was lighter than before and had done everything his dad had taught him. The fight wasn't over yet. He looked at his dad, his eyes moving over the familiar face. Jack had always been strong. The deep lines on his face showed that he had been through a lot in his life. But as Michael looked at him lying there still and quiet, he knew that it wasn't just the fight that made them strong. It was also their willingness to keep going even when things got tough. Michael leaned in closer, his words barely audible, as everything seemed lost. "Dad, I know you're still fighting, and I'll keep fighting with you for a long time." There was only the soft beep of the monitors, and then Jack's fingers moved in a way that was difficult to notice. When Michael saw the movement, his heart jumped in his chest. The movement was so subtle that Michael nearly missed it, but Jack's eyelids were indeed moving. Michael leaned closer to her, his breath shaky, as if his body were slowly waking up from a deep sleep. As his heart raced, he looked for any other signs of movement. The doctor and nurses rushed in, but there were none. Michael barely noticed them, preoccupied with his dad's hand and the slight tremor coursing through him. It was just a finger, but it was big enough for Jack to still be fighting over it. Jack's health gradually improved over the next few days, but he remained unhealed. But there was hope that he would wake up and get better, and Jack. Despite fighting for his life, Michael continued to fight for justice. The investigation into the crime was underway as Roy McDougal's hearing approached. The police were investigating, and the town was beginning to recover. Reform had started. Even though the road ahead would be long, there was hope for real, long-lasting change. They had shaken and broken the town. Something new was growing from its brokenness. A society. Michael stood by his father's side, vowing to construct a better system, having witnessed the worst of its methods. He thought about the path they had been on, the hard times and the pain, but he also saw how strong they were, the drive to fight for a better future, and as the sun went down over the town, long shadows. On the other side of the street, Michael knew justice meant protecting as well as following the rules. Doing what was right and making the world a safe place for people like his dad to live was the way ahead. Michael Carter was certain that they were on the correct path. If you liked this story, please share it with your friends. Leave a comment on the video with your favorite part of the story. Don't forget to sign up for more stories like this one.